Hi, welcome to Exploring Sunday's Scriptures, where we take a little bit of time to look into the scriptures that we will be hearing on this coming Sunday. So today is September 14th, as far as when you would have this video available. So that means this Sunday coming up is the 19th of September. We are returning to the discipline of the lectionary for a little bit. So we've been working through a series during the summer that was based on submissions or questions from all of you. And that concluded this past week with the submission of John 1:18 and a sermon that focused on the Trinity. So the lectionary, just to remind you, is a 3-year cycle of readings. The years are A, B, and C. That cycle of readings is intended to carry us as a congregation, or we as people of faith, through basically reading the entirety of the Bible in 3 years, or at least the majority of it. So that is what the lectionary ties us into. In that regard, what we find as we get into the discipline of the lectionary is often the readings are sequential. So that means from one week to the next, we're often picking up right where the week prior left off in the series of readings. Now, those readings include an Old Testament reading, or something from the Hebrew Bible, a New Testament reading, or something from the story of the early church, a gospel reading, so a story from the life of Jesus, and a psalm, so something from the songbook that is part of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. I incorporate that psalm as the call to worship, or at least parts of it, and then the other 3 readings remain part of what we hear on that day. What this offers as far as preaching, or the opportunity to have the word proclaimed, is either a focus on one of these 3 texts, or 4 if you include the psalm, or what is called a homily. And a homily, or homiletics, is where you find a common thread among all of the passages and weave that together into the sermon, or into the preached word. Now, the lectionary does not always lend itself well to a homily, in which case the general default for most pastors that I know is that the gospel reading tends to be where the focus lies on any given week. Not always the case, but generally that kind of is the course of action that's taken by most clergy with the lectionary, if there's not the possibility of a homily. The other challenge in looking at a homily, so the combination of, or a common thread among all of the passages, is it's hard to do justice to any one of the readings when you're using all of them in your message. So sometimes it is easier by default to simply focus on one passage because it gives adequate space and time in the sermon to develop, to be able to really expound upon that particular scripture. I'm not necessarily going to reveal the direction that I'm going during my time with you as far as a focus on one of the passages or on all in a homiletical fashion, but it will be up to you perhaps to think as we come to the conclusion, if you were planning worship and if you were ultimately writing a sermon or delivering a sermon, would you focus on one passage, or do you find a theme among all of the passages? So without further ado, let's get into our passages this week. And I'm going to be pretty much exclusively using the New Revised Standard Version. If I think that there could be some assistance to us in offering a different translation, I will share that as well. But in general, what I will be reading from is the New Revised Standard Version. And as we will experience them in worship, so I also will present them to you in the same order. Skipping over the psalm that is used for the call to worship, let me get right into the Old Testament then. The Old Testament is from the Wisdom of Solomon, which is not a very common book that we hear from, as is implied. This is what is considered part of the wisdom literature, which includes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, the Wisdom of Solomon, and many of the Psalms as well. So this is coming from the Wisdom of Solomon, also in some places just called Wisdom. From the first chapter, the very last verse of the first chapter, and then the first verse of the second chapter, and then it jumps to the 12th verse through the 22nd verse. So let's hear now from the wisdom of Solomon and see what we experience in this. But the ungodly by their words and deeds summon death. Considering him a friend, they pined away and made a covenant with him because they are fit to belong to his company. For they reasoned unsoundly, saying to themselves, short and sorrowful is our life, and there is no remedy when a life come to its end, and no one has been known to return from Hades. Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions. He reproaches us for sins against the law and accuses us of sins against our training. He professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. He became to us a reproof to our thoughts. The very sight of him is a burden to us because his manner of life is unlike that of others and his ways are strange. We are considered by him as something base, and he avoids our ways as unclean. He calls the last end of the righteous happy and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see if his words are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's child, he will help him and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us test him with insult and torture, so that we may find out how gentle he is and make trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected. Thus they reasoned, but they were led astray, for their wickedness blinded them, and they did not know the secret purposes of God, nor hoped for the wages of holiness, nor discerned the prize for blameless souls. Now it is hard in this to not hear directly a passage that seems to be related to Jesus, to be kind of the speakers of those who condemned and put Jesus to death, as a way to try to find out exactly, is this the Messiah? Is this the one that's on God's side or not? And so this really is not, it's an accusation against them for their behavior and how it is written here in the Wisdom of Solomon, but also lays out in some ways where their motivations come from: ungodly words, deceitfulness, and sort of this disbelief that God has any capacity beyond that which is known. So reasoned unsoundly. Short and sorrowful is life. There's no remedy when it comes to an end. No one has been known to return from Hades. And so we have here this scheming that goes on. Well, let's just wait for the righteous person. Let's just wait for this one who throws in our face all the ways that we are ungodly, that we are going against what is true and right and known, and one who does this as they are professing their own knowledge in God, and lives in a manner that is so different from the one that we live in. And in lying in wait or setting a trap, the purpose of that is to see if there is truth to what is spoken. Now, we may see in the gospel a link to this in some ways, as Jesus says what kind of end is going to befall him. But this is sort of saying, like, will we see indeed that the way he teaches and the way he lives is what is upheld as he is tortured, as he comes to his own end? So will that gentleness, will that peace, will all that has been espoused be what is maintained in that? So it's a very interesting passage, as I said, not one that is typical by any stretch of the imagination that we hear with any sort of regularity. I'm trying to see if I can pull up just a slightly different translation just for the sake of our conversation today, seeing as how this is so different. So let me see what I can do here. No, and it's because there are a lot of translations out there that don't include what we call the intertestamental or the apocryphal books, and the Wisdom of Solomon is one of these apocryphal books. An apocryphal book means a book of the Bible that lies between the conclusion of the writings of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and the writings of the New Testament. So the Gospels, the story of the life of Jesus, and the stories of the early church contained in the epistles and other letters and the pastorals that we have. And so not all translations include the apocryphal material. So generally you find this in the New Revised Standard Version, for example, the New International Version. Some of the more standard translations, or the ones that intend to be accurate as a word-for-word translation rather than a paraphrase, tend to include the apocryphal material as well. Now, that's the first reading that we hear on Sunday. So think of that laying the foundation. If you hear that first, you're going to be curious what the next ones are going to be. So we turn then to the Epistle of James. James is probably most known for be not just hearers of the word, but be doers of the word. James, one of the apostles, early people that was a part of the foundation of the church itself. And so let's see what James has to say to us. This is in chapter 3, verse 13, and goes through chapter 4, verse 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Oh, and there's a little more, verses 7 and 8. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. The final verse certainly seems to immediately tickle my ears, as I say, in the cleansing of the hands, as currently in our climate we know the importance of and precautions of hand washing and hand cleaning to allow people to remain healthy and safe through this time of pandemic. The second part of that is a purification of hearts, that there's more than just simply taking care of what's on the outside, as Jesus will say in a different place, but not cleaning up what's on the inside. And so this cleansing of the hearts is the other piece. As we do to the outside of ourselves to keep us healthy and safe, so also we need to do to the inside. And what does that look like? And I think we go back up to some of the earlier verses to understand what that looks like. This is that good life, that your works are done with gentleness and born of wisdom. So it's not so much a works theology in the sense of what we do somehow gets us closer to God, but it's because of what we know that our lives are then purified in how we approach life itself. And you have that here in those who are anchored, if you will, to the earth, an earthly, unspiritual, devilish. And in the wisdom of Solomon that we read, we could say that those who were speaking there, trying to put the righteous one to death to see about his truth and whether he'd maintain his gentleness, is those who have conspired in this way. Earthly, unspiritual, devilish, which is not related to the wisdom that comes from above. A wisdom which is very contrary in some ways to our human nature. And so that wisdom has purity and, pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield. So we're not obstinate or immovable, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And as you live that out, what you experience, we're in a season now of harvest, is a harvest of righteousness. A harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. So essentially, our lives themselves are at peace within themselves and at peace with God as we go about living this reality out, a reality that is informed by our faith and then lived in our good life. It goes on then to kind of develop this further in looking at conflicts and disputes, something that I think that we all experience acutely in the world around us, perhaps even within our own families, and asking the question about where this tension, where these conflicts come from, and setting them up with cravings. It's interesting, in Buddhism, one of the primary teachings in Buddhism is that we have to get away from our cravings. And when we stop craving, then we are capable of reaching sort of a wisdom. And this has the same thing, that the conflicts among us have to do with this selfish craving that causes us to be at war within ourselves. You might say the war of what we know to be true and right and good versus the war of our cravings that incline us to do things that may be contrary to those kind of things, of true and right and good, of pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, and showing no partiality. In ending with how to get there is submission to God. So that is how, as we draw closer to God, as we are in closer relationship with God, our capability of living that out, our capability of resisting the devil, the earthly things, the cravings, becomes easier, flees from us, because our hearts and our lives become aligned with God and God's ways. And that is how we not only cleanse our hands, so following good practices in our care and compassion of others, but also cleanse our hearts in the alignment of our hearts and our lives. So our faith and our practice, we could call it. Now let me turn finally to Mark. That's our gospel reading. So far in the two that we have, I would say you probably could find a common thread between those. And you could draw that thread out in the sense of dispute among one another and sort of how in opposition that is to God and God's ways, and taking a careful look at that. Let's see what we have in Mark to see if there's further information we can find there that also may or may not relate to the passages that we've already heard. So this comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. The disciples and Jesus went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone else to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." They did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" They were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. There's more about sort of aligning your life with God and how it is that our practice in life, so how we live, is a way that we acknowledge our alignment with the truth of God in our lives. So we have this sort of split into two pieces, just to kind of talk about this a little bit. The first part of this is transitional. So it's acknowledging sort of the geography. They are on their way through Galilee as they're sort of on the grander trajectory of Jerusalem. This is a point at which Jesus has become very honest and open about his fate, particularly the nature of his death and ultimately what will happen after his death. So as they make their way through Galilee, one of the interesting things that we have happening here is that this teaching is exclusively to the disciples. So this is not a broader teaching to a big group of people. This is exclusively to the disciples. I took a little bit of liberty in the beginning of this passage to help draw that out. So it starts, they went on from there and passed through Galilee. I said the disciples and Jesus went on from there to help you understand who the they was. Then the next line we have is, he did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples. So he didn't want anybody to know he was passing through Galilee because he was exclusively trying to spend this time with his disciples to teach them. And what his teaching was, or at least a piece of it, or the piece that is preserved here, has to do with his death and resurrection. And what we get from this is, as he shared this, they did not have one idea, one clue as to what he was saying to them. And it could be that anybody foretelling their own death is so far removed from our experience that it is uncomfortable and unusual and may just feel out of sorts. And so the absence of questioning on their part, put yourself in your shoes. If somebody that you were very, very close with told you that they were going to die in a specific way, and when it was going to, or sort of how it would unfold, how would you experience that? Would you question it further? Would you deny it? That also happens in other places. So that's why we have them silent. Is I think this is very much kind of what we would do, is we would deny it or try to get around it or fail to acknowledge it because it's uncomfortable to think about the conclusion of life, particularly one that we care for greatly. So what we have at the second part of this is they've arrived at their destination. So they've walked whatever length of the day they've intended to walk, and they are now where they are lodging for the night. In this case, we know it's Capernaum because it says it. And as they are now lounging after their walk, there has been conversation going on as they made their way. Now, with 12 disciples plus Jesus, if that's all there was, that's 13. There's no way for 13 traveling by foot to not have multiple conversations going on at the same time, whereby Jesus wouldn't necessarily have heard the conversations that were going on in the other small circles that end up forming as just part of 13 people walking along. And that's just limiting this to truly just 13. It's likely that there was more than 13, that there may have been some women also who were part of this, not just the 12 male disciples. So hard to know how large of a group this may have been. We know it's exclusively those closest to him, his disciples, who are named as disciples. But so when we get there and he says, now what were you talking about? If you think about sort of the chatter, as you're involved in your own conversation with one person, you can't quite hear or pay attention to what everybody else is saying or their conversations. And they go silent because their conversation on the way was who was the greatest among them. So it really is who is the greatest that is not Jesus. Jesus is their teacher, their leader. They name him that and they call him that. But they're now saying, where do we fall in this relationship? Which one of us ranks next after Jesus? And which one of us is the bottom of this, least and last fit of all? Again, probably a natural human inclination to seek out hierarchies or understandings of this thing. Maybe it follows on the passage concerning the end of his life well, as it looks at sort of who's going to inherit the movement or become the leader of the movement if Jesus is going on to his death. Now, the way that Jesus leads into this, or the way that he teaches from this, is by sitting them down, and then suddenly we have a child. And he takes this child up and says, anybody who welcomes, this vulnerable, impressionable one is the one who welcomes me, and the one who welcomes me welcomes God, welcomes the one who sent me. And the purpose here is to show that the primary reality of a follower of Jesus is servanthood and sacrifice. It's a giving for the sake of others. And a child cannot do on their own, so it really is sort of a life of service that's being espoused here. We perhaps dress this up as a cute passage with a kid in it and why we should be involved in children's ministry, which we should be. But this is really about servanthood and how the most vulnerable among us, those which don't speak or can't speak for themselves, or which we don't acknowledge as having much to offer because of their age, those that require us to feed them, to clothe them, to nurture them, that is what it is like for we who are followers of Christ. We are to serve the most vulnerable, the neediest among us. And as we do that, as we are in service to others, so it is that we actually have an experience, a connection, a relationship, a companionship with Jesus, and by virtue of that, with God, as Jesus also is, of course, the incarnation of God. So service, that aspect of service probably could be linked back in to the New Testament and the Old Testament passage as part of that common thread, to showcase or shine a light on two different approaches. One which is only interested in our own well-being and our own outcome, who's the greatest, and one that's aligning one's life with God, which is a life of service. And a life of service actually is a life of joy and blessing and peace ultimately. So these are our three passages for this Sunday as we return to the discipline of the lectionary for a little while, until our next series will begin. I hope this time has been helpful to you to begin to explore and listen to these scriptures a little bit. I encourage you to return to them maybe a couple more times before Sunday, so as you hear them on Sunday, you really can allow them to absorb into your heart and mind, and ultimately then to be incorporated into your life of faith as well, and to be able to hear in the proclamation the word that God has us for this coming week and in the weeks that lie ahead. Thanks as always for joining me for Exploring Sunday Scriptures. Always a joy to share this time with you.